I've said this over and over again. Broken hearts are easy to heal. Give me 6 to 8 weeks, everyone's going to climb out of a broken heart. Uncrazying someone, that takes years.
On this episode of the Psychology Podcast, I had a very enlightening and useful discussion with Dr. Ramani Durvasula about her latest book, It's Not You: Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic People. In this discussion, we talk about the warning signs in a partner, parent, boss, or friend, such as those who have a, quote, powder keg vibe. I love that phrase. As Dr. Durvasula notes, the personality pattern was there before you came into the narcissistic person's life, and it will be there after you leave. We also discuss the continuum of narcissism and the common myths about narcissism, as well as how to heal from these kinds of relationships. We also discuss the continuum of narcissism and the common myths surrounding narcissism. Dr. Durvasula's book is selling like hotcakes and has clearly hit quite the nerve amongst her mostly female audience. After listening to this episode, let us know in the comments whether it hit a nerve with you as well. So without further ado, I bring you Dr. Ramani Durvasula. Dr. Ramani, it is so great to have you on the Psychology Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Congratulations. First of all, congratulations on this wildly successful book tour, and you are popping up everywhere, and I want to congratulate you. And I was wondering, I want to start off by asking, why do you think that this topic of your new book, It's Not You, is resonating with so many people?
Because I think that many people have been struggling with this for the longest time, and they're not able to get answers. They get a lot of, well, the narcissistic person has a perspective too, and there's two sides to every story, and you shouldn't be using diagnostic terms, and maybe you should just forgive. So they've been shame, blamed, and shut down for forever. And now we finally have a conversation, and people are actually saying, oh my goodness, I am not out of my mind. So I think that people have been struggling in silence for a very, very long time.
Yeah, that's true. Well, something I really like about your book, which I read word for word, is that you go through so much, you take so much care to, before you even get into the relationship stuff, you take so much care to make clear all the caveats. This caveat, that caveat, there's 50,000 different types of narcissism, it's on a continuum, it's not always men, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's just cover some of those. The first one, I think it's a really big one, is that your book, you kind of talk about, it's like mid-level narcissism that you're not focusing on pathological or what would be diagnosed by a therapist. Is that right?
Nope, that's not true. So this mid-level of narcissism, so I think we have to get away from this idea of diagnosed by therapists, because the vast majority of narcissistic people are never going to show up into a therapist's office. And if they did show up into the therapist, the vast majority of therapists wouldn't clock it as narcissism. So take the diagnosis out. Diagnosis has nothing to do with severity. There are people out there with a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder who are not nearly as severe as people out there who are in someone's life who've never gotten that diagnosis because they never went to see a therapist. So we have to break away from this idea that severity and diagnosis go hand in hand. Diagnosis is merely an indicator that somebody saw a licensed mental health practitioner that issued that diagnosis, or were in some form of evaluation setting where this got evaluated. So I don't even think we should talk about diagnosis. Just throw it out. So narcissism, the personality styles on a continuum. At the mildest side, we're talking about people who are very self-centered, very almost emotionally stunted and emotionally immature, very superficial, very little regard for other people. They're a bit self-important. So they've got all the qualities of narcissism, but it's really at this milder side, which for another person will often be experienced as annoyance, unless you're their intimate partner and trying to do something like raise kids with them, and their desire to sit around and play video games all day while you're trying to keep a house running, it can feel quite jarring and angering. If a person was raised by a mildly narcissistic parent, a parent that was almost childlike and selfish and expected the child to almost hop to it, that's also very destabilizing. So it really depends on the nature of the relationship. And when we get to the severe end of the narcissistic spectrum, we're talking about more malignant narcissism, things that might look like more exploitative, the manipulativeness is heavier. There might even be sense of menace, fear,
Yeah.
greater isolation. And so that is for the people in those relationships can actually be quite unsettling, terrifying, and even culminate in things like complex post-trauma. But most people are in this moderate spectrum of narcissism where I'm sure a goodly amount of them would actually be diagnosed with NPD, but they're probably never going to get into a therapist's office. And here's we're talking about, yeah, there's some good days in there. These are people who are often functioning fine in the world, but their narcissism shows up most pointedly in close relationships. And because there's enough good days sprinkled in there, it gets very confusing for the people in the relationship. Will say, this person does and says these terrible, thoughtless, abrupt, awful, manipulative things, but then some days it feels like a normal thing, and then it doesn't, and then it does. And over time, the bad days become far more numerous than the good ones. And so that's why I wrote it for the middle, because in the middle we're not talking about usually we're not talking about aggression, violence, we're not talking about coercive control, we're not talking about the more severe stuff in this at the level I wrote the book. And I think as a result, people who are in a relationship with a moderate narcissist, for example, may not feel like a domestic violence agency would be the place they would turn because they don't identify with that.
Right.
And they also find that a lot of therapists don't clock it. Well, like, well, they get up, they go to work, they're successful, you have a nice house, and they make that mistake too. So I really feel that this group in the middle of this experiencing these moderate narcissistic relationships, it's not an annoyance, it's not terror, and we don't have a good vocabulary for it. So that's why I approached it that way.
Well, yeah, I agree. We don't have a good vocabulary for it, and you decide to instead of use the word narcissism, you like the word antagonistic,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
that really dovetails nicely with our own research work I've done with Keith Campbell, who I know you
Hmm.
know.
Hmm. Yeah.
And we've published a paper showing that antagonism is the core of all the
Hmm.
different types of narcissism.
Hmm.
So we covered grandiose and vulnerable, and but that's the core is
Hmm.
that personality source of variation, which is basically disagreeableness on steroids.
Yeah, and it's hostility,
Yeah.
and it's it's manipulativeness, it's arrogance, it's entitlement, and that antagonism quality kind of envelops other qualities like psychopathy, for example. So
Mm,
narcissism and psychopathy are very separate kinds of clinical states, but the antagonism's the through line, and usually the thing that's causing the most relational disruption.
mm. If I may ask, but you do mention this in the book. You say this book is personal.
Hmm.
Oh boy, that was really emotionally resonant when you talked about the dress
Hmm. Hmm.
situation. Can you just tell our listeners a little bit about what a young you was like?
Yeah, young me was, the core of her. She was an incredibly bright, studious, curious child, but there was very much the sense, from family of origin stuff as well as from the world at large. Sit down, be quiet,
Mm,
don't be your real self. You're being selfish. Why do you need? Why should we? Basically, the sense of nobody really stopping and attuning. It was the '70s, right? The '70s.
mm,
I mean, if you think the United States is a racist mess now, you should have seen it in the '70s. And so the only child of color in a school system was going to be chronically invalidated. And so it was the messaging from every place I turned around was don't be seen, don't exist, keep your head down. And that got internalized as a place of safety. If I kept my head down, if I didn't say anything, if I didn't need anything, and if I found a way to be a perfect child, then people would actually like me. And for a child, being liked is everything because that sort of tracks as attachment. It attracts as people will have your back. But I remember very clearly I would be by teachers, I would be the one who would be zeroed out, even if I made one wrong move where children who did not share my physical characteristics were getting away with stuff because the teacher knew their parents from church and the teacher knew their parents because they grew up with them. It's a small town. I didn't have that luxury. So it created within me a tremendous hypervigilance that I still carry to this day. And trust isn't easy for me, and all those things aren't easy. And I'm always still grappling with that sense of if I'm perfect enough, then this won't happen. I've let a lot of that go now. I'm 58 years old. You let some of that go.
let it
But I
go.
recognize what it does though is it creates spaces like solitude as being really, really important spaces for me because it's the one time I can sort of feel fully safe in my body and in my nervous system because I'm not having to hop to please someone else's standard.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. Um, it's obvious that this book is for survivors who have faced in very invalidating relationships through their lives. I mean, by having the book title, It's Not You, that the book title itself feels
Mhm.
validating to
Mhm.
so many
Mhm.
people.
That's the point. Yeah.
I know that was your point. I know that was your point. I know that was your point. Um, a lot of those childhood, I think the word is antecedents when it comes before.
Uh-huh.
Did I get that
Mhm.
right? Is it
Yeah,
antecedents? I
antecedents,
think
yeah.
a lot of the
Mhm.
childhood antecedents we have found of not grandiose narcissism, but vulnerable narcissism is we actually literally have items on our scale. Like when I was young, I always had to substitute my needs for the needs of others.
Mhm.
That actually
Mhm.
is a precursor to the development of vulnerable narcissism.
Mhm.
And I'm glad that you distinguish between grandiose and vulnerable, and rightly so. In most cases, people will fluctuate back and
Mhm.
forth, so they're not like clear cut things.
Mhm.
It's possible in a relationship for both people to score mid to high in narcissism, right? It's not
Mhm.
always like 100% the one partner's fault
Mm-mm.
and 0% the other part.
Mhm.
Can't interactions, like in a physics, kind of way of where certain or powder kegs powder kegs are kind of, you can predict it when you have like someone who scores extremely high in grandiose narcissism, let's say with someone who scores extremely high in vulnerable narcissism. Can't you see the recipe for disaster?
Well, it's an absolute recipe for disaster. When 2 narcissists, you gotta remember too, that I think what's challenging is that some of the elements of vulnerable narcissism, sort of feeling like failure to launch is a great thing. We typically see
Mhm.
that in vulnerable narcissism. The grandiose narcissistic people get stuff done. They do.
Yeah.
They're definitely more agentic, and their grandiosity almost propels them to believe that something that seems completely unrealistic, they'll sometimes bring it to fruition. Thus, their greater likelihood of success. The vulnerable narcissists, feeling so victimized, get into this sort of why should I bother? Nothing's ever going to go my way. Now, obviously, if those two people got into a relationship, a grandiose and a vulnerable
Right.
narcissist,
Right.
because remember, the core is that the vulnerable narcissist isn't just walking around victimized. They also don't have empathy. They're also entitled. They
Right.
also have that sort of the victimized grandiosity. Like I could have been one of the great ones, but nobody ever gave me a chance. I
Right.
didn't have a trust fund. So it's that kind of like it's begrudging. They do still have that need for admiration and validation. And since they don't get it because they're not doing anything, they also feel angry at the world. So there's this anger, solid. It's like they're like a powder keg when
Yeah.
we're talking about the vulnerable narcissistic folks. The grandiose narcissistic folks, they certainly can snap if things don't go their way, but they don't have that powder keg vibe, right? They don't feel like they're a pressure cooker that's boiling up. Now, the grandiose narcissistic person is going to lose patience with the vulnerable narcissistic
Yeah.
person for always being so hangdog, for always feeling sorry for themselves. I've seen this pair up before.
Me
The
too.
grandiose narcissist is like, get up and do something,
Yeah.
you lazy,
I've
whatever.
seen
And
it
then,
too. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's the backing and forthing, and that we see between that. I've seen it happens. I don't think as a rule it lasts because I think that the vulnerable narcissist isn't shiny enough for the grandiose narcissist. I think where you might see a little bit more staying power is two grandiose narcissists getting
Definitely.
together.
Power
Yeah.
couples. They're a
Mhm.
power couple.
Power couples.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I see a lot of that in the wellness space. Um,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
oh, yeah, come on, we know what's
Mhm.
up.
Mhm.
Um, but hold on, I love that you just coined the phrase "powder keg vibe." She's got a powder keg vibe, or
Mhm.
he's got a
Yep.
powder
Yep.
keg. Like,
Mhm.
I'm gonna
Yep.
use that for now on. But anyway,
Mhm.
no, I'm glad that you're meeting me at this level of nuance. It's very refreshing,
Mm.
to be able to talk to someone who has probably nerd outed at least as much as me, if not
Oh,
much
yeah, for
more.
sure.
Uh, Something that I'm trying to reconcile and just like talk this through with me at a very complex level is how, on the one hand, do we validate? Because I'm a big believer in validating people too for their real lived experiences, especially
Right.
people who have gone their whole. No, I see you, and I see what you're doing
Mhm.
with your book. But then on the other hand, how do we also empower people to take responsibility and not blame all their problems on,
Mhm.
oh, that narcissist?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so that's what I'm
Mhm.
trying to reconcile and kind of
Mhm.
grapple with as I was reading your book. I wonder
Mhm.
if you can help me with that. Yeah.
Yep, because I think that one way to do that is by giving people a very clear information base. Part of
Mhm.
the thing that most folks are grappling with is what the hell is this? Like, what am I up against? And since Very few therapists would tell them about it. There's very little content. They're getting nonsense messaging like you need to forgive this person. Everybody's different. They don't really mean it. They didn't intend to hurt you. They're given such mixed messages that when there's a clarity of message, right? So you validate the experience. This is not okay. And it's you really have to hold ground on what they're doing is not okay. I
Right.
understand they had an early life characterized by X, Y, and Z. I understand that it's
Right.
intergenerational trauma. I understand. They do that. And I said, you can understand that. That's wonderful. That's empathy and compassion. The buck still stops at the same point, which is what they're doing is not okay. And I tell people, you got to hold there. You got to hold there. That's it. They're not. Well, that's not okay. Then, when the empowering responsibility has to start with very clear messaging on what narcissism is, how it works, not these mixed messages. Well, there's a therapy and a law and a da 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 da, and then they can get better. Show me the evidence. I have
Mm.
never seen a randomized clinical trial in a population based sample that has shown sustained outcomes for people with narcissistic personalities. You put that study on my desk that is sufficiently powered and has enough replications, we'll have a different conversation. It ain't happened yet. And don't tell me, well, there was one guy in a study, good for him, that could afford therapy twice a week for 2 years and was highly motivated. Stop putting unicorns in front of people who are suffering, because in the vast majority, nothing's going to change. So when we make it clear, nothing's going to change. You're not alone. This behavior's not okay. This is what it's about. And you
Mm.
need to stop taking excuses, because this fool is able to go to the office and have their big job and get all that valid. If they can function so well in the world, they could pick up a phone and call a therapist.
Mm.
So once you give clients that clarity, they actually do start pulling out of it. Because one of the things I say is that you have been using them as a point of reference for too long. I want you to live your life and not care, because they don't care about you. So why would
That's
you
true.
care about what they think? And so the entire process is one of decathecting. Do some people get lost in that ideation of, oh, woe was me, woe was me? I think we have to call that grief instead of viewing it as self victimhood, which I will say happens for some subset of survivors.
Mm.
Many survivors are going through grief. They wonder, what would have happened if I had had parents who actually listened to me? How would I have chosen a better spouse? Would I have felt deserving of love? And I think that the letting go of that is a process of grief, and
Mm.
that takes time. And the more people are supported in that and not said, "Oh, how could you say such a terrible thing about your mother? She's such a good woman and now she's even dead." We've stopped that process of grief for them. That's how I push back on not push back, but like
Yeah.
say that I understand that we have to empower them and give them a sense of responsibility. But the other challenge they have is that they're surrounded by enablers who keep extolling the glories of the narcissist and how you're being difficult because your family member is just a little bit different than you. This isn't about being different. This is about being shut down. And because narcissistic folks are pretty skilled at having multiple behavioral repertoires and being
Mm.
very charming in public and being very cruel behind closed doors, nobody is privy. In fact, I've had clients, and I know it's probably illegal, they'll record a conversation for no other reason than to bring it into therapy. And I'll say, holy cow, like this is horrific. There's nothing they can do with that. They can't take it into family court. They can't play it back to other family members. They know they're doing something wrong, but they're like, I need someone to bear witness to this mess that I'm in. Am I losing my mind? So I think once we heal the broken heart, and once we do what I call uncrazying people, then
Mm.
I think actually most people do they do feel the sense of responsibility. The problem is the responsibility is trying to happen in a world with very punitive family court systems, a
Mm.
world that doesn't understand narcissism, a world that has cultural and duty and obligation kinds of responsibilities they throw on people. So what happens is people get stuck in these relationships. There's not always a clear path out, which can really be hard for folks who are stuck in this sort of perpetuity of being in contact with this. And part of the book is really on how do you heal, even if you have to have ongoing contact.
Yeah. Yes. 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 And yes. A lot of what you're describing, I think, applies to
Mhm. Mhm.
programming as
Mhm.
well. well, for similar reasons, because a lot of these cult leaders have similar characteristics. As
Mhm, mhm,
it's just like, what level is this operating?
mhm,
One on one or one on 50,000
mhm,
worshipers. Um, Something I'm low key obsessed with is the idea of the narcissistic spell.
mhm,
First
mhm,
time I ever used that phrase, but you know
mhm,
exactly what I'm talking about.
mhm, mhm,
And you watch, if you binge watch all these Netflix documentaries about the cult mind programming and everything, they always have the moment where the person's like, and then this happened and the spell instantly disappeared.
mhm,
But why
mhm,
does it take so long for the
mhm,
spell to disappear? And also, why are these people so attractive to so many people?
mhm.
Have you figured that out, doctor?
Yeah, they're attractive to all of us. They're charming, they're
Not to me
charismatic.
anymore. Not to me anymore.
Not to you, but then that makes you a unicorn, right? I
Okay.
think that
Yeah,
that to
yeah,
the average person, right?
yeah.
That the narcissist, and again, I would tell you to do a deep dive. Look at the academics you're around. Do any of them dazzle you because they have so many publications, even though they're a sanctimonious fool? Do a deep dive because I think all of us have some
Mm.
vulnerability to these people, and we give them a free pass because they're smart, right? So
Mhm.
I think that the charm, the charisma, the confidence, the credentials, the compelling quality of these narcissistic folks, it's a normal thing to be drawn to. It really is. I mean, what I'm trying to do is cultivate a sense of critical analysis when people meet these people. I said, when you meet people with these characteristics, take 3 steps back,
Mm.
because I always view it as like, it's like cologne. Like, what are they covering up? Why so much? Why
I hate
so
cologne.
dazzly?
I hate
Yes,
cologne.
exactly. I hate cologne too, but
Ugh.
it's very dazzly. And then many people, especially in the cultic space, when the thing you're looking for seems to be being delivered, and whether it's ideological, whether it's self-improvement, whether it's someone we feel sees us, whether it's a person who's moved to a new town and can't meet someone, and this represents a group that these human needs, which are healthy human needs. I think that the painting of people who get stuck in these situations as sort of broken winged angels or like
Right.
broken legged gazelles is nonsense. I think these are people who just might be having a moment in their lives or may actually be trying to improve themselves. So now you got somebody who's saying all the right things and other people are going along too. So how are you going to go? Now we're in Solomon Ash, right? Like if everyone
Yeah.
says this line's longer than that
Yes.
line, well,
Yes.
I'm going to be the one person who says that's a lot to be that person. And we are a social species. So to take a stance that could result in us losing a tribe is not what we're hardwired to do. So when people are making these choices, they're actually doing things that are actually very species congruent. They're attachment oriented, they're affiliation oriented, and they might even be designed for a person feeling like, oh, I'm finally choosing a partner or a person in my life that is doing well, that is succeeding. And I'm no longer going for this kind of not as good a partner because they're using these superficial characteristics to say, I found someone healthier. And now in a cultic space, they're selling something that makes sense, But at the same time, they're selling that really like cool message. They are destabilizing and undermining the people. So the people are not only going for the message, they're losing identity, they're losing a sense of self, they're being fed the dopamine of a sense of belonging, all of that. So those two things are happening simultaneously. And now a person finds themselves very stuck in that system, sometimes collateralized against the cultic system, has gotten information on them that they'll have no problem using against them. And then, yes, there's that moment, that penny drop moment. Dr. Yanya Lalich, who's a sociologist, who's a cult expert, she calls it breaking the shelf. And breaking the shelf is that moment when it could very well be somebody, even from your old world, says, it's so funny. I remember how much we used to love going fishing together. You still go fishing? And just even that waft from your old life. Maybe that day you're asked to do something, you're like, okay, no. Maybe that day you see someone else you love in a system who is suffering and you actually are able to register their suffering more than your own. And
Mm.
maybe it's just accumulation. Whatever it is, that shelf breaks. And when the shelf breaks,
Right.
you see it. And once you
Yeah.
see it, you start that slow path to healing.
Yeah. Keith Campbell has that whole model of like the first 9 months you're under the spell,
Mhm,
and then those that slower relationships tend to grow more
mhm.
over time. Um, so, Doctor Ramani, do nice guys really finish last?
The research tends to show that in many cases they do. There is actually some
Ruh-roh.
empirical literature that says men who are higher in agreeableness tend to make less money. And so I think then that's a statement on society, right? We're a capitalist economy. So the sort of the zero sum game of it all is whoever's going to make the money, who's going to close the deal, who's going to get the thing, and there's only one thing to get, or there's one, there's one thing to get, then that's going to be the person who's willing to be a little bit ethically slippery,
So
the
it pays
person
to be
who's
an asshole. It pays to be an
it,
asshole.
in terms of making money, it definitely pays to be an asshole.
But give me an instance in which it pays to be a good human.
I think it pays to be a good human when you're doing something that involves building up sustaining systems,
Whew.
and that might even be, you know what I'm saying? Like
Okay.
that could be anything. If you're teaching people, if you're treating people, but above all else, it all comes down to what the outcomes are, right? If the only outcome is dollars and cents, the assholes are always going to win.
Well, what
But if
about
the
in terms of getting sexual partners? Because that's usually
well,
the context in which people say do nice.
narcissistic people do better. They
They
do
do.
better. Yeah,
They
they
do.
in fact, they have that early, they're able to keep someone in early, and
Yeah.
then all the research shows that when it falls apart hard. But if you're looking at a numbers game, and now in the era of online dating, narcissistic people kill it in the online dating space
Yeah.
because they love the numbers game of it all. They love dropping 50 lines in the water, and they're basically just sort of like, it's like a marketing blitz, right? Who's going to bite back? And it might be someone who doesn't know better. They have very attractive of those grids of pictures. They know how to have, it's almost like they have a starter kit. Like, here's me holding a puppy. Here's my abs. Here's me in front of,
They're so
fill in,
strategic. So
fill in
strategic.
whatever national
Yeah.
monument. Here's me hiking. Here's me cooking. Here's me with an
Yeah.
old person that we're
Yeah.
assuming is a grandparent. Like,
Yeah.
they know exactly how to sell a story because they're selling a story about themselves. So yes, they're going to get someone to have sex with them. Are they going to be able to create a long-term sustained healthy relationship? No, but unfortunately, if they can, as you said, as Keith says, they're still playing. People are still under the spell in 9 months. In 9 months, a lot of decisions can be made.
Yeah.
People can get engaged. They can move in together. They can
Have a
get
child.
pregnant.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. We said that at the same time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but this is on my mind as well because I'm preparing a solo episode on the science of do nice guys really finish last.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm accumulating all the different evidence points from research. Yeah, it's cool. You make it clear in this book you do have a in your myth section that you're not only talking about narcissistic men. But I would say most of your stories are about narcissistic men. Is there a particular reason why you made that decision?
I actually think dig deeply. If you really
Oh,
went
okay.
and had a piece of a pen and paper, you would see there are
It balances out.
non-binary people represented in the book. There are women represented in the book who are narcissistic, and there are men. And I went through and I said, I
You
need to
okay.
make sure. So that actually is
I'll
more
add
balanced than you would think.
I'll add it up.
Yeah, it's more balanced than you would think. They're not. I mean, listen, a lot of people out in the world complain about having narcissistic mothers because the impact of a mother as a caregiver, still to this day, they remain to be a more primary and sometimes impactful day-to-day caregiver. But lots of people have narcissistic mothers. A mother can be narcissistic. There were at least one, maybe two vignettes in the book about a person who was struggling with a narcissistic mother, female narcissist. And so I think that we know grandiose narcissism is more prevalent in men. We know that malignant narcissism is more prevalent in men. I have not seen good statistics on communal narcissism, but that might be closer to equal. And we know Grijalva's research suggests that vulnerable and grandiose narcissism are pretty comparable in terms of their prevalence rates. And that makes sense because vulnerable narcissism, I would argue this, and I think others would too, vulnerable narcissism almost feels like a milder variant of borderline personality disorder, which is much more common in women.
We see gender difference in vulnerable narcissism. Yeah, so not the mother example, but just like a 35-year-old woman example in a relationship can be narcissistic, of course.
Absolutely. But that 35-year-old woman will become someone's mother. So if we revolve that recording on the person who's talking about a mother, their mother was once a 35-year-old narcissistic woman in a relationship.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah. So what have you noticed? Who is the primary? Are women your primary base, or would you say it's more balanced?
Women are going to be my more primary base because there are more male narcissists. I mean, I'm not saying it's 100-0, like that's not true, but it's certainly not 50-50. So obviously women are going to be my base for another reason too, is that women hold less societal power. We may have made strides in that, but they may not have the same financial power. They may have stopped working in a relationship with a controlling narcissistic person. So they're facing far more far more peril if they're going through a narcissistic divorce. So
Mm.
I think that the people who are gravitating to this content, but I have worked with many men. So it might be closer to a 75-25.
Yeah, I know that you've spent decades, working individually
Mhm.
with people on this. So really, to your credit, this book is informed by not just research, but also your personal experience,
Mhm. Mhm.
for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think, well, it's obvious to me why your book would resonate so much, and why an awful lot of women reading your book probably feel a sigh of relief. Like that they feel seen maybe for the first
Mhm.
time in their life. So I totally get that. I think it's tough sometimes with the whole question of like, who is the real victim? Have you become really good at like, can you tell like if you have two people on the
Mhm.
couch and they
Mhm.
both point, because what you will find in these kind of relationships, the person that the woman who loves your book is calling, saying my partner's if you interviewed the other partner, I'm sure they would say that the other one's the narcissist.
It's not even as always as somebody saying to me, my partner's narcissistic, my mother's narcissistic. They're also saying like, I feel like I'm losing my mind in this relationship. So they're not even using the narcissism languaging. They're
I get that.
using the
I get that.
I feel crazy. Nothing I do is enough. This person keeps betraying my trust. They're
I
not
get
even using that languaging. The languaging of what I'm bringing around narcissistic relationships is sometimes the first time they're saying, oh, this is actually a thing. This isn't just my messed up situation, that this whole constellation of traits, and then they kind of work backwards. They're like, check, no empathy, entitlement, check, arrogant, check, excessive need for admiration, check, lies, check, needs to controlling, check. They're like, okay. And then they wake up, they open their eyes to like, this isn't going to change.
Yeah.
But they didn't even actually come in through the narcissism door. They came through the emotional abuse door.
Well, that's a good point. That's a really good point. It's funny. I don't know if funny is the right word, but it's interesting. I've written articles. I wrote like a cover story, how to spot a narcissist, for Psychology Today, like a long time ago, like 10 years
Hmm.
ago. And I got a lot of emails from narcissists who were upset by my article,
Heck yeah.
saying that I wasn't showing them compassion, um, and that um, and that why would I shame them? So what do you say to someone who reads your book and was like, you're not showing an awful lot of it feels like you're shaming those who score high in narcissism. What's your response to that?
First, I disagree firmly. I actually think that this book is one of the most compassionate takes
Okay.
on narcissism. It went through the editorial process so many ways. And
Mm.
to my credit, I am very fortunate to have a great editor who said, let's soften it here, because she said, if you demonize, and she was right, we struggle with this, it makes it harder for the survivor. So I actually think I'm giving a very compassionate take. But that
Mm.
said, if a person feels you're not being nice to me, the first thing I'm going to say to them is, have you looked inward? If these are your patterns, have
Yeah.
you stopped and really taken a census on who you've harmed from your behavior? And have you gone and made amends to those people? Because
Right.
if you've done that, then we can sit down and have a conversation. But if you're going to come for me like you've come for everyone else, then this conversation's over.
Right. Well, you look at you, Ms. Healthy Assertiveness over here.
Well, it's not even healthy assertiveness. It's
Yeah.
online abuse to the point of threats. I mean, if you think you got it for one
Oh.
article, I have been the stuff I have
Oh, you get stuff
endured.
too? You get
Oh
stuff?
my gosh.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
threats and awful and you're a monster and all of that.
Wow.
And I'd say, okay, so if it's easier for you to say, woe is me. Oh my gosh, you're shaming me. How could you? Instead of, whoa, I just read this piece. If somebody's insightful enough to have read a piece and said, this could be me, that to me is promising. Now go take the next steps. Unless you say, I can't be bothered. Why can't people see I'm so great? And the
Mm.
people who tend to be more grandiose, malignant, and more defended, vulnerable narcissists, they're the ones who come for me. I mean, and again, I'm an easy target. I'm a woman. It's easy to say terrible things that you're going to do to me and how you're going to harm me. But that's a
I don't
real occupational risk in this work.
I would push back there a second and say, from my perspective, you're not an easy target. You're pretty fucking badass.
No, no, I mean, no, I'm
I
actually,
wouldn't
I'm
fuck with
more.
you. I wouldn't fuck with you.
I'm actually, I get like, I will say, basically my attitude is,
Yeah.
I don't like when people come from me saying, it's again, it goes back to my own trauma history, but
Yeah.
I have to say that it's not okay, because I get emails from narcissistic folks all the time. And when they're written well and normally and self-reflective, I just answered one the other day, and there was just a piece about me in the New York Times yesterday. And
Mm,
he's like, I read that. And now I'm like, oh, and I can see the mess I've made in my life. And I actually rarely respond to emails. I said, let me respond to this guy. He wanted a recommendation of a book. And I
mm,
said, first of all, this is amazing. It's not easy to push back on these defenses. And here's a recommendation for a book that I found useful. So I will always meet that where it is. But if the attack is, how could you make me feel so bad? Instead of taking a step back and saying, I'm doing these things and these things aren't okay. It's once again, they're not taking responsibility for what they're doing, and they're deflecting blame on you or I for writing about
yeah, for sure. In this new book that I'm working on, in the intro, I say, "You will probably really love this book until you realize I'm talking about you."
it. Yes,
I
right, right, right. That's
have
right.
that in the intro.
Hmm.
Yeah, no, I hear you. So let's talk a little bit more about how people can heal if they feel like they're losing their mind, right?
Hmm.
Like, and that's
Hmm.
really kind of like what you're talking about.
Hmm.
I really like this. Well, okay, I'll just tell you my favorite chapter in your book was embrace radical
Mhm,
acceptance.
mhm,
I've been trying to
mhm,
practice that myself. I'm on my own journey. I think I'm growing a lot in that area, if
mhm,
I say so myself. But can you talk to our audience a little bit about how people can embrace radical
mhm.
acceptance?
So, even ahead of the radical acceptance piece is to understand what all of this is. I mean, to
Mhm.
learn about narcissism, how the personality shows up, how the behaviors associated with it, and how it tracks with how it's affecting you. Get that sort of under wraps. Then it really radical acceptance is integrating all of that. And it's not about signing off on their behavior. It's not accepting this is how it is. It's that it's understanding this is not going to change. And
Mm,
so while you're in this relationship, these are the patterns that are going to show up, and to have realistic expectations for this is how it is. By the time somebody's reading my book, they have tried 17,000 ways to communicate with this person. And
yeah.
so it's no longer about explaining themselves. And so radical acceptance is that heavy thud of, this is never going to be the parent I wanted. This is never going to be the relationship I wanted. This person is probably not going to be solicitous of me as I grow older. Like, it's the aware that, the infidelity is probably not going to stop. Whatever it is, it's that awareness of like, this is how it is. Now, the challenge with radical acceptance of seeing it clearly and recognizing too, not only is it not going to change, it's still going to hurt you. Some people say, well,
Mm,
I radically accept. Does that mean that now it won't hurt me anymore?
right.
No, they're doing something hurtful. If I told you to radically accept someone's going to punch you in the face, they punch you in the face, it's still going to hurt you when they punch you in the face. It's just that you might have been a little more prepared for the punch. And so I always tell folks, I know we've gotten to really deep radical acceptance with you when you're no longer surprised by their behavior. So they are going to do their new invalidating thing or manipulative thing or, whatever thing of the week. And you're just like, you're almost like, one of those characters in The Office, like Jim, like, here we go. Like, this is how it is. And so you no longer are like, I can't believe this is happening. You don't wail, you don't cry, you don't get upset. And I like that when that happens for people, because when they no longer get into the wailing and the crying, I'm fine with anger. Anger is great because I think anger is a clarifying, motivating, and mobilizing emotion. But the wailing and the self-blame, that's not good for you. The surprise is not good for you, even at a sympathetic level. But once you get there and realistic expectations are starting to kick in, you also have a lot of grief. I mean, people will say, I avoided this radical acceptance thing all along because I wanted to think like this whole family thing was going to work out. I didn't want to think about the idea of dismantling this relationship. And so the radical acceptance means you're kind of living in cognitive dissonance, and that's a super uncomfortable place to live. But it is also, now you're recognizing that you're also aware of, it's not you. That asking somebody, would you empty the dishwasher, is not a capital crime. It is not disrespect. It's the normal expectation within a relationship that someone might say, I can't do it right now, but they could say it calmly instead of screaming at you and accusing you of you not being appreciative of everything they've always done for you, right? So you start to see what is not okay. And like I've said this over and over again, broken hearts are easy to heal. Give me 6 to 8 weeks, everyone's going to climb out of a broken heart. Uncrazying someone, that takes years. And this is a process of uncrazying people. And so that's what I'm trying to bring them out of. So they're like, I see your game. And so even if you don't separate from the narcissistic person or
Wow.
stop talking to them, you're like, I see what's happening here. And so, and then the healing part becomes about writing it down so you can see the patterns as they exist. It's about not feeling compelled to forgive them because really this is not okay. And it's about creating other areas of support for yourself, people who do see you where it is healthier. And is it not, people don't consider it a happy ending that you've like radically accepted that you're married to someone who's just not a nice person, and that you're going to have to endure it, and you have healthy friendships. But some people will say, this was my path forward. I don't come from a culture where I could get divorced, or I did not want to go fight this person in family court, or we can't afford to pay 2 rents. Like, there's reality here, but that reality, when it's steeped in radical acceptance and the person can do other things to substantiate them, finding meaning and purpose oriented activities. Most people turn their damn narcissistic relationship into a full-time job, no longer put energy into it. It's really doing the bare minimum in that relationship, not defending yourself, not engaging with them, not explaining yourself. And don't personalize it. They do this to anyone who's unfortunate enough to be standing where you are. That's it.
Wow. I see why you're popular. Wow.
Thank you.
Wow. You are good. You were good. You were, what's that from?
Well,
It's a quote from something. You were good. I don't know. I feel like
and see, that's the great thing about having gone through this. Like, I'm never going to hold on to the "I am good" you, but I'm going to keep trying. And
was
I
that from
also
the
know
Fockers? The Fockers. What was it?
maybe, maybe it
He
was,
goes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Robert Nero.
Robert. He goes. Yeah, we're good. No,
Yeah,
I see it. I've
yeah, I can see
interviewed.
it too.
You can see it about yourself.
No, I can't see the "Oh, you're good." No, not about myself.
Oh,
I
oh,
can see the line in the movie, not
oh,
me.
gotcha, gotcha.
No,
Oh,
no.
I was like, that's some confidence. I
That's
like
gonna get
that.
no. I definitely don't see
Yeah.
it in me,
Well,
but I
I
see
see
it
it.
in clients. I never am ever gonna doubt another human being saying, "This has helped me," and I
Yeah.
get to hear that, and that's a blessing. But it also kind of angers me because
Oh.
they should have gotten it a long time ago, and we held this information back. I sometimes feel the field of psychology betrayed everyone by not
Mm.
sharing what we knew, and we were more interested in defending the narcissistic people than we were in protecting people from what was
Yeah.
happening in these
Yeah,
relationships.
I get that, and I get that that's a major impetus for this book that you
Mhm,
wrote.
mhm.
My producer just texted me. It's from Analyze This.
Analyze
Yeah,
this. That's
there you
right.
go.
That's
There
what
you
it
go.
was.
There
Yeah.
you go.
Mhm.
Um, uh, there's a particular combination within a relationship that is so I don't want to use the toxic. I'm trying to go this whole episode without using the word toxic, but there's a particular it is kind of toxic, and
Mhm.
that's the caretaker slash people pleaser person
Mhm.
archetype
Mhm.
with the and it could be male, female, whatever, with the perpetual victim mindset person. Now, I've
Mhm.
seen this, and I'm sure you've seen this over and over again. That dynamic, holy cow! It's like so the for instance, the victim mindset person perpetually, and I'm saying on a daily basis, is like, oh my god, like how could you not call me today? How could you? I'm suffering so much because you didn't
Mhm.
call me
Mhm.
today. And then
Mhm.
the people pleasing caretaker person is constantly perpetually in the I'm sorry
Mhm.
stance.
Mhm. Mhm.
Oh
Mhm.
my god. I mean, I just feel like that's such a prominent sort of combination in our society, and it's like how can you help people look at the red flags like way ahead of time if you can.
Yeah, no, it's what we got to remember too is that with people pleasing, that we've got to take a step back, because one of the first things I try to do to analyze people pleasing, it's not like you're a people pleaser, but what are the origins of this? Is this a trauma informed behavior? Was this a way a person maintained attachments? If a person has a narcissistic parent, being a people pleaser was the only way they were
Mm,
going to get any form of attunement from that parent. So that people pleasing might have literally be now a psychological safety behavior.
mm,
And so I think that that's one piece of the analysis of sort of doing the deep dive of what's the function of people pleasing, because usually it reflects this idea of only by doing am I going to be safe, right? So that becomes a big part of this conversation dyadically, and for many people pleasers it has that origin. It was the only way to get attachment, it was the only way to get attunement, it was the only way to feel safe, right? And so the people pleasing almost becomes a sympathetic nervous system response. It's not
mm.
even something that's manufactured. It's I've got to make sure everyone's okay, because if they're not, a person doesn't feel good in their body. Now you throw into this the victim mindset person, and they're an empty well. You're constantly having to fix And so fixing becomes love, solving becomes love,
Right.
telling them reassurance becomes love. And
Yeah.
narcissistic people need a lot of reassurance,
Yeah.
for how confident they are. They need a lot of reassurance because remember that insecurity kind of shame cauldron within them is always bubbling up. So they always need to be told it's going to be okay, but you have to tell them it's going to be okay, not in a way that shames them, but in a way like, you're the best. How could this not be okay? It can't be like, it's going to be okay, hun. It's going to be okay. Then they'll get mad at you. So you can't even reassure them unless you do it in a way that is propping up their ego. So the people pleasers really need to almost work backwards to recognize the psychological safety function and then really do the work on that's no longer a function that's needed in adult relationships. You're no longer the child trying to get an attachment. You can go and find people where relationships are mutual and reciprocal. Again, that takes time.
It does take time. One of my favorite books, I don't know if you've read it, is by Harriet Brocker, called "The Disease to Please: Curing the People Pleasing
Oh,
Syndrome."
interesting. Interesting.
Have you come
No,
across it? Yeah.
no.
I think it might be pronounced Breaker, but Braikeer is her last name, and
Mm-hmm.
she's no longer alive because I was trying to
Mm-hmm.
contact her when I was writing my book and thank her
Mm-hmm.
for writing her book. But yeah, it's just a super interesting book on overcoming the people pleasing
Mm-hmm.
tendency.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think it's possible to like anything to overcompensate and be like, no more Mr. Nice Guy, and then you become an asshole, so you can go from people pleaser to asshole.
I don't think I see. I did. Here's where I disagree. I don't think you can go from people to pleaser to asshole.
Really?
I don't.
Really?
I mean, obviously you can if you tried, but inherently, because the people pleasing is so somatically held, it is so relationally held that it is taking all of that. I mean, the person literally, when I'm breaking people out of these cycles, they have to literally sit on their hands and not do the dishes after the dinner party. I'm like, I don't care what you need to tell yourself, but you helped set up, you brought the food, you did all the things, and now you're not doing the damn dishes. That doesn't make them an asshole. That means they're
Oh,
actually
that's true.
engaging in a small bit of self-care. And I think one of the tricky bits is that the person who's no longer engaging in all the people pleasing does think of themselves as an asshole. That's where they go to that very self-harming language of, well, I didn't help with the dishes, and I didn't do all the things, and I didn't wake up at 3 a.m. and pick them up from an airport. They think they're an asshole, but they're not an asshole. They're saying, well, no, I worked until 10 o'clock last night. They can take a taxi. I can't get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to do this airport run. I'm going to make myself sick. And least of all, for a person who's not going to appreciate it, you might do it if it's your kid. You might, but to give yourself that opportunity for discernment. But is that the people pleasers feel like I'm just going to keep doing this because it is such a trauma kind of based behavior. So I've not yet seen a people pleaser
Yeah.
turn into an asshole. I've never seen that happen. No.
I've seen it in the what was the community like 10 years ago, the pickup artist men community, where you had a bunch of, like, I'm tired of being Mr. Nice Guy, and
Yeah,
then they
but they're
become an
they're
ass.
vulnerable narcissists, so
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
not
no,
people
well, yeah,
pleasers,
that's yeah,
right? They're not people pleasers.
that's
They're
I've
manipulative,
said that. I've said
victimized
it's a community
fools.
of vulnerable narcissists who have as their gurus grandiose narcissists. So the ones who
Correct.
this is what I told him. Yeah, this is what Mark Manson and I talked about on the podcast. That's the dynamic of a lot of
Yeah, no, 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 no.
yeah,
These are all vulnerable narcissists. Like
yeah, yeah,
every one of
yeah.
these guys,
Good
every
point.
internet troll. So
Good
they're
point.
not people pleasers.
Good
Not by
point.
they don't get to be in that club of people.
Okay,
Oh
okay,
hell
interesting.
no.
Okay,
No.
interesting. Okay, okay. Um, well, cool. I'm glad we're having such a raw, honest conversation. Um, hey, look, I want to end this conversation with you talking about how people can rewrite their story. This is
Mhm,
maybe
mhm, mhm.
I was struggling to figure out which was my favorite chapter of yours, whether or not it
Thank
was
you.
not the radical acceptance one or the rewrite your story one, but they're both up there for me. So can you tell people how they can really, emerging from this feeling like that you're crazy,
Mhm,
and emerging from it, and then how can you just truly move
mhm,
forward? Yeah.
mhm. You got to remove the narcissistic person from such a central role in the story because I even will have people say, I'm going to go out and I'm going to go back to school and finish my degree and do the this and do the that. Very important things to them. And I'm going to show my dad. I'm like, stop, edit. I'm going to go back and I'm going to go back to school and I'm going to get my degree because it's something that got thwarted and I understand why, but this is important to me. End of sentence. We've got to stop using them as our counterweight. I'll show them. I'll prove it to them. They'll be so proud of me. They don't care. So number one, sweep them out of the narrative arc. This character is gone. We're not writing the story with them in it that much, other than maybe a developmental influence. But then it's sort of back plot feature, right? It's not they don't get a role. They're just sort of a plot feature that sort of shaped you to this point. And yet, despite that, and that's why I use that model of the hero's journey, because it really applies here. Is that the person who is trying to do this is walking away from everything they were told, like please your family, be what everyone wants, go along, make compromises, be self-sacrificing, forgive, go along to get along. That's where a lot of people find themselves in the story. And I'm a bad person if I'm not going to do that. So now it's about, even as I said about the people pleasing, when you rewrite your story, instead of like, oh, I'm such a doormat, no, I'm not a doormat. I was engaging in a behavior that helped me help make me feel safe. And I actually am safe. I'm no longer the kid, and I can protect my inner child and hear them when they're like, this doesn't feel safe. And I say, I get it, but I got this. And you can care for yourself instead of I've got to, I'm always going to be the person who has got that fawn response, or I'm going to be the freeze response person who doesn't know what to say. And then as you go through this process, the rest of rewriting your narrative is you recognize that, everything I thought was going to happen kind of did. I did see it clearly, and I did disengage, and I did become the bad one. And my family did tell me I was greedy and selfish, and there's something reassuring, and that's actually how it went down, because it only confirms what I thought to be true. So now I can give more permission to my voice, because as long as I stayed in that system, I was going to have to live to do things the way they wanted. The story that gets informed by the data. Sometimes you have to take the risk, and that's where the grief comes from. When you finally do the thing would resulted in the loss of love, you do the thing and it results in the loss of love, exactly as we thought it would. That becomes part of the story.
Wow. I think we're on a similar page here. In my new book, I'm trying to get people from a victim mindset to what I call an empowerment mindset.
Mm-hmm.
What I like is how you don't just keep people in the phase where they're just talking and ruminating.
Mm-hmm.
I'll use the word
Mm-hmm.
ruminating, but you're actually helping them move forward. And I think that's so
Mm-hmm.
important, because I
Mm-hmm.
think we kind of live in this culture right now where I think you can be rewarded for just ruminating about it and getting likes on social media for talking about what has been bad, which can be beneficial for sure. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
completely
Mm-hmm.
invalidating that, but I do think that shouldn't be all there is to the story, to use the word story there.
Right. And there's a point where you can, use, but the rumination is part of the grief. It's a part of the letting go. It's a part of the off gassing. And I do think it's an important part of it, because many times people haven't had safe places to do that. But then it's also like the rumination can be happening, and then there can still be slowly a pivot into, like I said, making
Right.
friendships and relationships where you feel seen and heard. And the big key piece here, though, is the mistake people make is they start launching into a new direction, whether it's going back to school, launching a project, whatever it is. But then they make the mistake of telling the narcissistic person about it. It's almost like making a very precious little sculpture and saying, look what I made. They're just going to knock it out of your hands and it's going to break. Don't tell them. They can't know you're doing this. They can't know you're healing. They're going to try to stop you. So
Wow.
you just go do your thing and you don't let them know. And one day you'll be the balloon that just sort of flies off, and that'll be that. But don't tell them, or they're going to tie a rock to your balloon.
You'll be the red balloon.
Mm-hmm. Off on your authentic way.
Do you remember that
Instead of
movie?
living for them.
Do you remember that movie?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hey, Dr. Ramani, thank you so much for being on my podcast and for the work you're putting out there.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the work you're doing, and then the work you've done with folks like Keith and everything. That theoretical foundation is what allowed me to jump off and to really do this work. So thank you.